Good afternoon. This is podcast Safe and Safe Country. And me, its author and the host, Alina Frolova. I'm dealing with the security and defense sector starting from 2014, and I'm very keen to explain a lot of things which are happening in simple words. So in this podcast, we speak about our country, Ukraine, Europe, the world, about the war, about what will be the victory, when it will be, about NATO, about the position of EU, what European security means, what will next US elections bring to us, and so many other questions which can influence your daily security and your daily life. This podcast is produced jointly by the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. You can find us on all the resources of Ukrainska Pravda as well on the largest podcast platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, SoundCloud, and other. Don't forget to subscribe and to receive updates and join new episodes. And today I have a very interesting guest, Andrzej Falkowski, PhD in economics, Lieutenant General retired of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Poland, strategic advisor to the Ministry of Defense in 2018. Yes, Andrzej?
2018, but Minister of Defense of Ukraine, not Poland.
Yes. No, not Poland. And just to give a short description, and actually this is where we met, that when Ukraine decided to be more transparent in reforming its army, so-called DRAP was established. DRAP, this means the Defense Reform Advisory Board, which consists of high-level representatives of the security and defense sector of our key partner states. And Andrzej Falkowski was one of these representatives. He represented Poland. And he was part of the group, advising to the ministry regarding reforms. You're also specialist in public finance, military economics, and defense resources, logistics, strategic planning, and, you know a lot about NATO. And I think that we will discuss all these issues today. Welcome.
Thank you very much for invitation. This is important. I don't know what is my specialization now after 40 years in the uniform and spending 14 years abroad, mainly in NATO 3 times and in United States. Thank you very much.
And being in armed forces, what was your specialization there?
When I started, I don't know, everybody wanted to be the pilot, sailor, as you know, or spy.
Yeah,
or
very romantic.
Hans Kloss, something attractive. But I ended up in the Military Academy of Logistics and I became the financial specialist. And my first almost 18 years of my military career was in the finance, dealing with budget at the highest level, because very soon they took me from the Navy. I wanted to be sailor, as I mentioned, and moved to Warsaw. Then the real challenge started, because I am the example of so-called spiral development. Mm-hmm. I was not abstaining from new challenges. I was trying to do anything possible to do something interesting in life. My first assignment abroad was 1998 to Brussels, to NATO headquarters, when we were not the NATO member yet. We became NATO member in 1 year time. I spent there 5 years, and then I started to work for General Staff in the Directorate for Strategic Planning, J5, as a deputy chief. Then I moved again to the finance, but as the boss of the budget department. So I was responsible for whole defense budget of Poland. Then I won the competition for international position, and I went back to Brussels as a director of logistics and resources division in the international military staff in Brussels again. So when I came back, they didn't know what to do with me. So
and they sent you to Ukraine.
They sent me to United States as a defense, military, naval, and air attaché for a couple of years. And when I came back, they nominated me as a deputy chief. And in 1 year time, the minister called me and said, okay, we have vacancy in Brussels, so you have to go to Brussels as a military representative to NATO. And I spent there 4 years, and that was the end of my let's say, spirally developed career.
So many issues you touched there. So I would
Oh,
like
yeah.
to ask, you've been present in Ukraine and you've been just like monitoring and observing how reforms are going. And so you have some kind of deep knowledge of everything, what's going on here and what was planned and how the plans were implemented. And now we have a lot of scandals, again, connected to the misuse of finance, let's say. Sometimes it's corruption, sometimes it's misuse, sometimes it's something like connected to finances and logistics. Looking from your position and from your knowledge, how Ukraine can cope with this, what we should do to make the situation better and to make it quite fast because we are in war.
I cannot say that I have deep knowledge because the situation in your country is changing very dynamically and dramatically because of war. Of course, I'm observing very closely, and before COVID, I was in Ukraine over almost every month. Also, not only on the draft meetings, but also delivering lectures under DEEP program, Defense Enhanced Education program, under the NATO auspices. I was in Odessa, I was in Kiev. I was planning to go to Kharkiv, but I couldn't manage because of time. And I was delivering presentations on the planning, programming, and budgeting, because this is something which I am missing in your system. And what I'm talking about is transparency. If you go transparent, nowadays it's a little bit difficult because it's war and you cannot be so as transparent as possible because the enemy is watching. But normally you should, if you have transparent system, nobody would even dare to go for corruption and so on and so forth. What I was missing also during my 5 years in Defense Reform Advisory Board was continuity. During that time, I met 4 ministers. Soon it would be 5th minister. So in every year, different minister. And we met when you were Deputy Minister of Defense. And I met recently, I was 4th of July, I was in Kiev. So I met Andrzej Zagorodniuk. And I consider his program of reforms as the best one. In your practice, it's something wrong with this continuity because each minister has the ambition to start from the scratch, which is a big mistake. That should be followed up. You might change a little bit priorities, but you cannot start reform from the very beginning because you will go to nowhere. That reminds me some English lessons. You went through the different courses. I started my English when I was 33, 34 years old, and I started different courses, and everybody started from I am, you are, and so on and so forth. So I didn't make the progress until I found my own method. And that was too late, but I had to catch up with my children. Over.
Okay. And looking now at the situation, how Ukrainian army, how Ukrainian armed forces are operating on the ground, and taking into consideration your military background and experience, how you will evaluate it? When you speak to your colleagues, to your friends, explaining what's going on in Ukraine, how you evaluate the performance and capability of Ukrainian armed forces?
This is very difficult question. Normally, people are saying this is very good question when they don't know what to answer for that question. And this is very much multifolded question. I have to admit that I'm talking about some regions, being 9 years under the occupation, because the war started, as a matter of fact, in 2014, and 2022 is continuation of that war. It's very difficult to make the progress when the enemy had 9 years to enforce themselves, to establish some strongholds, to prepare for counterattack for so many years. The same goes to Crimea, and the same goes to the east of Ukraine. And of course, you are under the pressure, demographic pressure, because probably now the Minister of Defense is the biggest employer, because your Minister of Defense is employing about 1 million soldiers. But you have to all the time change, adjusting to the new equipment. This is not easy. You get used to for years being the military. I know how difficult it is to switch from one system to another, but you have to do it in express time. It sometimes doesn't work. However, if I am taking all the factors into consideration, I have to admit that I'm under the impression that you are making so much progress.
And what about progress of, for example, Polish army? I mean, that I've been spoken to high-level officials, commanders of armed forces of Poland, and they are quite serious about the threats which Russia is bringing. And we saw that it's implemented somehow in strategic planning that Poland will substantially increase number of armed forces of you, and they try to get the new equipment to be prepared. But what is the progress in Polish army? And do you see some signs of change in the strategy and change in the perception in other NATO armies?
Definitely, yes. We are talking about progress now, but let me jump at the beginning very shortly to the time we were joining NATO. There are some complaints that Ukraine cannot join NATO because Ukraine is not ready. Nobody, none of the country we joined after 1999 was fully ready to join the alliance. Still, the armed forces of different NATO nations are operating post-Soviet equipment. Still, they don't have all the procedures at place. They didn't accept all the standardization agreement. The personnel doesn't know English at the level which allows interoperability, and so on and so forth. So that was the beginning. We were making, let's say, 24 years progress, and we are still progressing. We are still having post-Soviet equipment in Poland. And of course, Poland is the only European Union and NATO country which borders country attacked Ukraine and Russia at the same time. There are no other European Union and NATO country. This is special place. I'm not mentioning Belarus because it's different story, but we have also huge border with them. Not as huge as you are, because you have 2,200 kilometers with Russia and 1,000
200 something with Belarus.
So you're in the worst position here. But our government has decided to buy a lot of modern equipment. We have so-called Korean invasion, thousands of tanks of these HIMARS-like launchers and so on, and the airplanes. And we are buying F-35s as well from the United States, very expensive. We are modernizing armed personnel carriers. We are buying Abrams tanks. We are buying HIMARS. We are buying a lot of stuff. And I am afraid that we will have affordability problem soon. At the same time, you have to take into account that the equipment itself, I'm calling these military toys, are probably the cheapest part of this modernization, because according to different estimates, 1/3 of the money you have to spend is for equipment. The rest is for logistics, infrastructure, training, personnel, and so on and so forth. The government decided also to increase the number of personnel. We used to have 100,000 plus territorial defense, but they want to increase the number to 150 regulars plus 50,000 territorial defense, which is huge effort, and there are not too many people who wants to serve. We will see. We have 15th of October, we have the elections. I'm trying to be apolitical, so I'm not taking parts, but the elections might verify a lot of those reformistic plans. And the rest of the nations
they also
are trying also to reform themselves. Germany promised to spend additional 100 billion euro, but they didn't mention that this is over 5 years. And in Vilnius, they promised that they will finally spend 2% of GDP for defense. And after the Vilnius, they withdraw this promise. The same, let's say the example of Netherlands, they abandoned or they deleted tanks in their armed forces. And now it's the time that they are coming back to the previous kind of equipment. So a lot of European countries, especially those who are closer to the potential threat, and we know who is the threat, are investing now in the armed forces, which is the must.
Okay, you've been inside NATO for many years. You know how decisions are made. From what we see outside, let's say so, before it was like impression that a lot depended on US, France, and Germany. And so their decisions were crucial for making any final decision within NATO. From now on, the situation is changing. Poland took a very active voice in European Union, in NATO, on international sphere. Many smaller nations like Baltic nations and probably northern nations, they became more also, let's say, they speak a lot and they provide their vision, which is more radical on the situation which is happening. These changes somehow influence the NATO decision making. Are there any, I don't know, substantial moves inside the political decision making? And can we expect the more fast and more brave, maybe, decisions from inside NATO?
Again, perfect question for this podcast. I have to admit that even being 12 years in NATO on 3 different positions, I had difficulties in understanding how the decisions were going around. In NATO, you have this consensus rule. Everybody has to agree, and nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which is the weakness of the alliance on the one hand side, because it takes a lot of time to go around for lobbying and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, when NATO takes the decision, everybody stands behind that decision. And NATO is about committetology. There were 200 committees, working groups. There were less, there were more. I remember the time when there were 400 committees, and then Secretary General limited this number, but the working group started growing. And it is North Atlantic Council. It is the summit, but at the level of the presidents and heads of state and government, is taking decision after all the working groups on the way to the decision agree on different subjects. Very painful, very long-lasting process. Now, the big countries like US, UK, France, sometimes Germany are trying to influence, and there is always kind of race to the solutions, and they are trying to gather all the supporters around the project. Sometimes difficult matters agreed very easily, sometimes very easy matters are not agreed at, or it takes few years to agree on some projects. And if we are talking about influences, it's always quid pro quo, because sometimes nations want to bargain for own good, of course, and having their interest in mind, and decision is pending on the agreement on the other issues. So very complicated landscape, and sometimes you have enough of that. Sometimes you don't see the light in the tunnel, but this is organization which will have 75 years. Mm-hmm. In the next year. So very interesting, but very difficult to get to the one conclusion.
And what Ukraine should do to overcome finally all the skepticism or, questions about the entering organization?
Now you are a little bit in better situation, because finally you have NATO-Ukraine Council.
Yeah.
So you can always try to call the meeting of NATO-Ukraine Council and express your view on different matters. But at the same time, you have to show your determination, and you have to show the reform, not only in the defense matters, but in the whole country. Because as a matter of fact, it was wrong perception also here in Poland that the military are joining NATO. It's not true. Whole country is joining NATO, and everybody has to understand that difference And of course, I don't agree with the decision which was taken with Vilnius, because if this is up to me, you would become the member at once. As I said, nobody is fully ready. And somebody is talking that you cannot join because you are at war. We have the example of, for instance, Germany, which was torn apart, but in 1955 they became the NATO member, and then they rejoined many years later. So for me, this discussion is not understandable at all, taking into account that you will hugely strengthen the alliance. I'm always showing to my colleagues the statistics, which is in global firepower. Very interesting statistics. 60 different factors are taken into consideration. So it means that it objectifies the picture of the position of the country. And this picture shows that Ukraine is mentioned as the 15th strength, military strength in the world. Poland is 20th. Germany, surprise, surprise, is 25. So if Ukraine joins NATO now, you would only behind US, UK, France, nuclear powers of NATO, Turkey and Italy. Ukraine would have 6th position. We would be behind you. Can you imagine?
Italy on 5th place? Italy?
No, I don't know if Turkey or Italy is.
Seriously, I never thought about the Italian army as the big one, or the.
It depends what they are taking into account. They have big Carabinieri, which is under the Ministry of Defense, big Navy at the Mediterranean Sea, and so on and so forth. But Spain is, for instance, behind us, 26th position, and so on and so forth. Look at these statistics. It also includes some economic factors like gross domestic product, population, the possibility to restore the economy, and so on and so forth. 60 different factors, and you are 15. Congratulations with that. However, that should never happen under war circumstances. And that's the first factor. The second factor is that you have probably the strongest army. I'm not Army, Navy, Air Force, army in Europe now. And this army knows how to fight with the symmetric enemy. We can pretend that our generals, our soldiers got the experience during peacekeeping, peace enforcing operations somewhere in Afghanistan or Iraq. But this war was kind of not symmetric war. Taliban didn't have airplanes. Taliban didn't have tanks. Taliban didn't have missiles or rockets. Some maybe, but very accidentally. Here, you can use very modern equipment from all over the world. I was talking about this at the beginning. And now you know how to control the area, how to attack, how to even hide in order not to be killed. So having such a support from such a big nation with such a potential, military potential for NATO would be only in favor of NATO's strength. Another point is the magic Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which doesn't exclude you from the membership. What Article 5 says is that you have to become the NATO member. You have to be European state. You are European state. However, I will refer to that later. You have to be able to promote the principles of the treaty. You are promoting, you are trying to reform in that direction and contribute to North Atlantic security. You are very much contributing because you are defending all Europe. And now, of course, the fourth precondition is to enjoy unanimous support of existing members. And this is the difficult part. Of course, a lot of countries are lagging behind the US. They are hiding behind the US back. And they are saying, ask Americans, we are not guilty, we will follow America, and so on. Not true. The US is not the only country which is hesitating. There are many more at this stage, and a lot has to be done to convince them and to bring them to their senses that postponing decision on Ukrainian path to NATO until the end of the war may induce Russia to continue its warfare indefinitely. So Russia was threatening us when we were becoming the member. Then, I don't know, some politicians were able to convince Yeltsin, I don't know, under the influence or not, but it doesn't matter. They signed this NATO-Russia Founding Act, which Russia violated from the very first day.
As any paper they signed.
Not only paper, but also words. They are violating everything. I can say that I'm on the blacklist of Putin with the ban from entering Russia from 2015.
This is honor, I believe.
Yeah, I'm not complaining. I find myself, when I was in the NATO headquarters, among 89 Europeans, politicians, soldiers, and so on. In that list was, I don't know, 18 or 19 Polish, and I was among them. So I can say whatever. It doesn't harm my attitude. But we are not against the Russian people. We are against the Russian establishment and the way they are leading their huge country.
Let's come back to the battlefield. We heard a lot of, let's say, consideration in Western media that the counteroffensive is not effective, it's too slow, that we need to start negotiations with Russians. And of course, we have our own vision of all this. And Ukrainian vision is quite different from what we've read in these articles. What's your vision about the counteroffensive? How you perceive the situation? And what's your vision about the possible route of war or possible course of war?
Another question from the serial that I don't have the crystal ball, but probably your vision is the best. You can feel the ground, you can feel the territory, you can feel the expectation of Ukrainian people, and you know what to do. However, now it's a fight for the resources for the war and the international support. I am not complaining the counteroffensive goes slowly. Normally, it takes years to remove somebody from the territory. And I'm always referring to the Second World War, when all the forces were moving and this west and east and west then took years. I don't wish you the same situation, but I'd rather expect from the nations to increase the sanctions on Russia, to isolate Russia, not to support their war machinery anymore, because even trading with Russia is harm for your country. Of course, it will be difficult. It will cost you a lot of lives and the equipment. And I don't know what to do to speed it up, because the expectations were that by the end of this year, everybody would be removed. But this is huge territory. You have to talk to some politicians that Crimea is bigger than many European countries, that the area is 1/5 of Ukraine, is much bigger than most of the European countries. So you have a lot of people, a lot of potential, a lot of resources to fight. And on the other hand, Russia has immense potential. However, you very much dented that potential, which is good, because it's good for the alliance and egoistically for my country as well. I don't know. I would simply concentrate more on different directions. But it's always dangerous that they will take you into trap, and initial excitement will slow down everything. But with those mine clearing, with everything, it's mission impossible at this stage. However, you can win that war.
Yeah, we are absolutely sure in this. And I think that Polish people always will support us in this fight. Probably one of the last questions, it's what we should do to have more stable world after this war. How the international system should change, whether NATO should change, whether EU should change. What could be those steps we can take now to guarantee that at least next, I don't know, 50, 70, 100 years next after this war, we will have a peaceful time. Should we change something principally?
Should Ukraine change? Yeah.
And the world and Europe?
This war is changing the mentality of everybody in the world who is thinking rationally, of course. But as I said, the longer distance to the threat, the less tension, and nobody cares or care less than necessary. First, European Union membership can be seen as a substitute because European Union was faster in their decision making.
Yeah.
But I remember the time that was between 2014 and 2018 when I was military representative to the NATO and European Union Military Committee, when we were having discussions on the security situations, and we were only talking about situation in Africa. And I was raising hand and asking, Mr. Chairman, is Ukraine in Europe? Yes. Why don't we have the intel briefing? Why don't we deal with Ukraine here? Of course, maybe next time. So nobody cared. But European Union membership might be seen as a substitute. And that gives the impression that that would be easier to implement than to join NATO. This is very wrong impression, I would say, because European Union, first of all, is not giving you security guarantees.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, there are many technical and economic aspects of the European Union, and all the decisions of European Union are kind of binding. We joined European Union 5 years after NATO membership. So I don't want you to have such a path. I want to be in parallel, but that might turn more difficult than joining NATO. Now, there are a lot of miscalculations about Ukrainian membership. As you can observe, also they are presenting the ideas that Russia is huge and all the countries which are surrounding Ukraine or supporting Ukraine might be enemies of Russia. So countries are afraid. Countries are afraid of their elections as well. So it's very much political that electorate will now elect others, not those who were supporting Ukraine openly. So many myths around those. As a matter of fact, you have to increase strategic communication. I was always telling in NATO that NATO is losing the war of strategic communication, about the truth of NATO, about the intentions of NATO. And Russians are perfect in this malign propaganda, I would say. And you have to do your utmost to better inform your own people, to convince own people, but everybody seems to be very much convinced. Razumkov Center said that you have almost full approval for the Ukrainian membership to NATO now, which was not the
94%, I believe, or something
which
like
was not the case before the war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you have to convince the world. I mean, very aggressive information campaign to UN, to NATO, to big players, to small players, because small players might convince the big players in NATO. Don't miss anybody, even those countries in NATO who are not having armed forces. There are some, like Iceland, for instance. Yeah. Don't miss anybody, because at the end of the day, you have this consensus rule. The world will not be the same. I would be happy if China is not supporting Russia. If China stops supporting Russia, Russia is done, in my opinion, because they would not have the access to many, many goods, electronics, and so on, which may be in a little bit lower standard, but still supporting this war machine. I would be happy if the Africa comes to their mind. But as you can see, there is big fight in Africa over the resources between superpowers like China, like post-colonial countries, and so on and so forth. So, but they still don't understand the problem having own local wars, including former Wagner group or whatever. I am hoping that next year will bring some new approach. I don't have too much expectations because we have 3 big elections coming. You have the election in your country, presidential.
That's questionable yet. We have
That might be postponed because of war.
Yeah, because of the martial law.
You have election in the United States. Whatever the results, US will continue this course, probably in supporting. And you have election in Moscow. So if Putin is alive, he will probably be again re-elected. So not much change. There was temptation with Prigozhin adventure, but that was very much misleading because to change one monkey with the razor to the other monkey with the razor was very, very difficult to swallow to the normal world. So at least this adversary is better known. However, nobody knows what he thinks and how he thinks. So that would not be the same. Nobody would be making very easily business with Russia. And that might be the great chance to your country for restoration and re-establishment some sectors, because you have to act very fast. Of course, you need the access to the Black Sea, which is forgotten at this stage.
Absolutely.
And everybody talks about warships, but you can defend Black Sea from the land and from the air. So I don't understand the predicament you are. Simply, that would be very, very much difficult. I'm kind of constructive pessimist always. But in this case, I'm trying to be very much optimistic, but having in mind all the obstacles you will still be in.
I think that's a very good word to end it up. And there is just one note from my side, maybe you want to comment, that this war also changed very much relations between Poland and Ukraine. And before we have all this post-Soviet legacy with questioning the history of each other, with some kind of periods in our history when we have questions to each other. But what I see now, this is restoration of very good friendship, very good support, and some principal things which are based on values, which united our nations in these difficult times. And I think that Ukraine will always remember the help, support, and all the efforts which Poland is doing in this war towards supporting Ukraine. So I think that's very good, output of this war, that our nation started to become much closer. And there could be a lot of good outputs of this war. And I hope that we will keep this track and we'll see positive things. And someday, after the victory, we will celebrate together with our Polish friends. And so we'll be in long friendship in this history. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. One word on that. I was always on the position that we should, of course, respecting the past, because everybody has the past. And like Okudzawa is singing, no bezgrzesznych nie znaje przyroda. All nations are having own sins, but we should let bygones be bygones, and we should build the future together. Not talking, because we can go blaming each other forever. But finally, we should go over that, and we should build the future together.
Yeah, good words. Thank you so much, General. And I would like to remind you that it was Safe and Safe Country podcast, and I am its host, Alina Frolova. And we do this podcast together with the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. You can find us on all resources of Ukrainska Pravda, as well as on all the podcast platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, SoundCloud, and others. Safe and Safe Country. It depends on each of us how soon the word unsafe will disappear. Thanks.